Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another video here. A little bit of a different video, both in topic and template than we've been doing recently here. Kind of back to the gaming, kind of back to the technology aspect of things that, you've kind of grown accustomed to, I guess you could say, on my channel here, with another VR episode here. And in this video, as you can see from the starting slideshow here, as well as the title of the video and everything, I kind of wanted to do a history of VR and like a timeline of VR video here, kind of going from what I consider really the iteration of VR all the way up to the present day and some of the big developments and everything. And I really hit on a lot of the topics there. And also touch on the future and what I think holds for the future of VR and VR headsets and everything. Obviously, this is mostly going to be related to gaming aspects. There are some aspects outside of gaming that has been developed in VR, but this is really for VR headsets only here. And you might notice I don't have a webcam on this time around just because I didn't want to get it into in the way of the presentation or any of the pictures or any information, and I didn't feel it was necessary. So yeah, let's jump right into this, the history of VR here. I wanted to kind of start with the early days. VR is a bit of an interesting timeline in the fact that there's a lot of dead space when you come to the early days of VR, or at least what I think is kind of the start of VR. You can make a lot of grand claims and concepts about those little headsets that you flick through pictures are really the first VR or whatever. Or like the ideas of VR going back hundreds of years even. But when we're talking about the history of VR, I want to talk about actual VR headsets, especially when it relates to video games and technology here and something that you'd recognize kind of somewhat as a VR headset, as a gaming console, as something that is, 3D, kind of immersive world experience here that you've come to know and love from VR. That, in my opinion, and what constitutes the early days and the founding of VR really, is really 1995 and the Nintendo Virtual Boy, which obviously, again, we say that the VR scene has a pretty big gap in its timeline. You might know why, because Nintendo Virtual Boy is famously one of the worst and most, prevalent examples of a video game, console or video game device launch failures of all time in 1995 there. The Nintendo Virtual Boy, you can kind of see to your bottom right there. It is the first thing that ever came out that, I'd really count as virtual reality and something that you recognize as virtual reality headset. Essentially, the headset there, as you can see, you can put it on that little stand and you essentially kind of leaned your head into it, almost looking into it like one of those like binocular stations at like a zoo or something. And, a 3D display of whatever game you were playing, which there's only a handful for the Virtual Boy in America that ever actually released, but still, you'd lean your head into the device, putting your eyes in there and everything, and you'd see this 3D image of whatever game you're playing in this like red and black display that kind of didn't look great, didn't look quite right. The resolution and the graphics weren't very good. The headset itself, the overall configuration of it, of course, wasn't very good either. It's not something that was strapped to your head. It's not something you could really wear with your head here. It's very uncomfortable to play for long periods of times. The games weren't particularly good. The headset itself wasn't particularly good in build quality, design, or internal graphics. Obviously, there weren't any really VR controls or controllers like tracking or anything. You just held outside of, I guess, kind of in front of you or below your desk or whatever you're playing, you held this kind of awkward looking mirrored like image, kind of wonky looking controller here. And just played with that as the way that corresponded to what you saw in the headset while you're leaning into it. Overall, just not a very good headset in general. It is what most people would first recognize and consider a VR headset, though. But yeah, it's really, I mean, there's no tracking. There's not really much to look around at. There's no VR controllers. It is, for all intents and purposes, almost like a 3D gaming experience, which I guess you could argue is VR in general, of course, but it is very limited in virtually every factor. That combined with the lack of marketing and competing with other consoles that are more popular, Nintendo Virtual Boy in 1995, historic flop, Actually, a bit of a collector's item now because of how few were actually ever sold or made. But yeah, very bad thing. Next, you have the Sega VR headset, which I don't know. I pulled this picture off of the internet. I'm not sure if that's actually how it was going to look. Obviously, as you can see in the parentheses there, it never actually launched. And we'll get this in a second as to why this kind of caused such a big gap in the VR headset within the Virtual Boy here. As you can see, other companies around the same period of time and the years following the Nintendo Virtual Boy had been interested in VR, were theorizing stuff, but apart from, as you can see here below it, the failed VR arcade machine venture there, no one really tried VR for the most part in any way that you'd really recognize or even launched any of the headsets they theorized or thought about. No one launched them because of how bad the Virtual Boy did. Even though, as you can see, there's a lot of different theories, and the VR headsets probably were going to look pretty different coming from Sega or the VR arcade machines that eventually came out. We're going to look different. They had different functions. They were mounted differently, like on your head and stuff. And that, I don't even know if it's a prototype, but that like theory of what it may have looked like is a lot different, a lot better than the Virtual Boy. Sega, seeing the Virtual Boy kind of flop there, didn't really want a piece of that. They decided to just focus on their consoles. Never really actually launched the VR headset like they theorized. Then the last venture in the VR before, nearly what is it, like 1995, like you go 10 years in the future. So for nearly like 2 decades, almost 2 decades, the only other attempt at VR, if you remember, because this is even before my time with the 1995, 1996 here, that I'd be playing video games or anything, the VR arcade machines. And I've seen some pictures of these. Obviously, they have arcade machines and stuff in arcades and like Dave and Buster's and stuff today, but they're much different than what these were. I didn't include a picture of these just because I don't know. I thought the two big main points of the thing were the other headsets, and the arcade machines didn't do very well at all. Like the Nintendo Virtual Boy, they're very expensive. They're kind of a niche thing. You couldn't really charge enough for it to make a profit and make sense to a lot of people. They weren't very good. They didn't have a lot of great games or anything. And the thing about arcades and like these VR studios that people go to, um, another thing that kind of has always turned me off of them and why I only really use personally owned VR headsets is no matter how much you clean them, you can never shake the fact that like you're putting your head into something that like hundreds, maybe thousands of people have also put their heads into and sweated into, and just kind of grimy and everything. So that's a lot of reasons the VR arcade machines didn't really do well, and that's kind of the early days of VR. And that's where VR kind of is left off for almost 2 decades, essentially. Or not 2 decades, but until around 2013 here with the resurgence. So I guess almost 2 decades actually. It's not that far off to say that. But as you advance here into the return of VR. Now I stretched it out a little bit and didn't make 2013 its own slide, which you could argue it deserves because it did return. You see the real first resurgence of VR and VR headsets since 1995 with the Nintendo Virtual Boy with Oculus. Oculus in 2013, as well as a few other companies, as you can see here in the following years. And from 2013 to 2015, VR doesn't peak or anything. It doesn't, fizzle out and go the way of the dinosaurs or anything. It doesn't have the same trajectory that the Virtual Boy did with the flop or anything. This is the return of VR. This is the resurgence of VR, and this is the arrival of what you would consider modern VR, what you recognize as modern VR in 2013 with the Oculus Rift Development Kit 1, which is pictured in the top right there. So yeah, these are some of the headsets I just included pictures there. Oculus DK1, again, the return of what you would consider a modern, what you'd recognize as a modern, normal VR headset here. Came in a pretty like weird packaging there. Had a bit of a odd kind of like very rectangular display there. As you can see, it's a PC VR. You get the headset, a few lenses, lots of wires and charging and connectors there. You basically hook this up to your PC. You use either a mouse and keyboard or an Xbox controller. It's basically what everybody used to control it. Doesn't have VR headsets. As you can see, it didn't have like the lens changing that you have in modern VR, or like the lens or the optical view changing. It had different sets of lenses that you would kind of plug in place. You had to take the VR headset out and take them and interchange them as you wished, depending on what your eye comfort was, depending on your personal preference there. It's very bare bones as far as today's standards. But I mean, it was the only game in town back then, but still. A lot of wires, pretty clunky, not great field of view, but it was the return of VR that people hadn't seen for again nearly 2 decades, and it was compared to something like the Virtual Boy, which I guess you could say it's quote unquote predecessor in VR history. It knocked it out of the park. It was head mounted, wasn't the nicest field of view or the cleanest display or refresh rate, but it was miles better. It wasn't red and black. It was actually like in color, or like in multiple colors, I guess you could say. Um, you could play a handful of PC VR games with it. You could actually look around. It was mounted on your head. You felt way more immersed. It was way more comfortable. It was way better graphically speaking. It was a big step, and it was a pivotal moment in VR with the resurgence here. You get next year in 2014, Oculus still really the only game in town. You get the Rift D Development Kit 2 in 2014, which is essentially why I didn't include a picture of it. Is essentially just a slight improvement over the DK1 in virtually every way. Um, just improved on everything that you would think in a VR headset. Kept the trend of upward momentum and improvement in VR going, which is good. Also in 2014, the only really other big headset you see is the Samsung Gear VR, which strays away from what had been completely just PC VR up until this point and going towards mobile VR, which for a minute here in this 2014 to 2015 and everything era in 2016 and stuff was a pretty popular concept. A lot of people thought this was the future of VR. Obviously, that's not really true for the vast majority of cases here. But regardless, Samsung Gear VR, essentially you put your phone into the main kind of headset spot there, and it was a head-mounted, mobile VR experience. Actually, in a partnership, you might be able to see it kind of on the side there. It's a little small with Oculus. So Oculus, still up to this point in 2014, really has a hand in everything VR. But you get mobile VR for the first time with the Gear VR there. It's pretty good for what it is. It's actually, as you can see, the cardboard there. It's a lot more comfortable than a lot of other mobile VR um, equivalents will come out here in the recent years here. Pretty solid concept, pretty interesting concept there. And the last little tidbit of things, major points I included here in the return of VR era in the slide is the Google Cardboard released in 2015. 2015 was kind of an odd year, not a lot of good stuff in 2015. As you can see, going through the list here, I'm not going to include literally every VR headset ever released onto the slides in whatever year they were released. I'm going to try to hit the big pictures and the big players, because if I listed every single VR headset ever released in every market, this would be a lot to get through. Google Cardboard, though, why I chose to include it, obviously not much of a VR headset, more of a VR accessory for your phone. You put that in there, put your face into there, like hold it up to your face, and you can kind of see around in 3D. Again, it extends that mobile VR. It's the cheapest VR quote unquote headset or accessory really ever released there. It gets a lot of people interested in the concept of VR. It's a lot of people's first introduction ever, or like introduction at all to VR. I think it was just an important kind of point there, and probably the biggest thing that actually happened in 2015 for VR, honestly. Next, after the return of VR, it's a pretty legendary return here. We do have a slide all alone to 1 year here, which is probably the golden year of VR when you talk about the return of VR. 2016 was the real boom of VR. So you have some. These are three. I listed four headsets, but the three that I pictured are the major things of VR and why it really took off and what people really got involved in 2016 that made it that. So just going in the listed order of the words here, you have PlayStation VR 1. It's in the bottom right there. This was, well, I think this is probably the most impactful VR headset out of all of them, even though it's not the best VR headset out of all of them. It's the worst technically speaking because of the non-PC requirements. This was an accessory for the PlayStation 4 back in the day in 2016. You had to have a PlayStation to run it. This was PlayStation, Sony's first venture in the VR, and this was the first console VR. Obviously, Xbox has never really done VR. Nintendo's kind of done it in a way, but not really. PlayStation's really the only one who's really deeply ventured into VR. And why this is important, not just because it was Sony's and PlayStation's first VR headset, it was because this was the first VR headset that was far more accessible to the average person, not only because of how big PlayStation is and how many people have a PlayStation already, but because that, on top of the fact that this didn't break the bank, the headset and the kit itself didn't put you out, an absurd amount of money like some of the other VR headsets during, after, before this, and you didn't need a fucking supercomputer to run this shit. And you just need your PlayStation to plug it into. That opened up VR to such a wider audience than a lot of these high-end PC VR, very impressive headsets, but still very expensive headsets ever did. PlayStation VR 1, obviously there's 2, it was just a VR back then because there wasn't a second one, but it had its problems. Obviously, given the price point and the console it's running off of, it wasn't as powerful as the other ones, but it wasn't as expensive to set up all around as the other ones. You had issues when the PlayStation VR 1 initially launched. They didn't have the tracking. Like those VR controllers you see there weren't included. The motion camera wasn't really included. It was really just a seated VR experience that you played with a PlayStation 4 controller. It was like a 3D experience. Over time, and following that up, though, they got the controllers, they got the motion controllers, they got the motion camera that you set up and kind of do full body tracking and hand tracking and everything to play VR in a way you recognize it today. But yeah, I think it was a pretty pivotal moment in VR. Uh, First console VR really opened up the floodgates to a lot of people who really hadn't ever got to experience it because they didn't have a high-end computer. Some other big things in 2016 that made it the year was the HTC Vive. In 2016, and for several years after this, the HTC Vive, really until I'd say 2020, or maybe 29. I don't know. There's one VR headset you all know in the PC VR scene that really outdid this in every way. Not another Vive one. I mean, but for years, 2016 and onward, the HTC Vive was the fucking pinnacle. Was the creme de la creme. Was the top dog of PC VR. It was the high end choice. It was the best choice. It had controllers that weren't complete ass or like actual VR controllers. It had, as you can see, those base stations there. It had good tracking for your movement on your head and your hands and everything. The headset itself obviously is connected to a computer, but the headset itself, on top of having a computer support it, had by far the most powerful graphics. It was the best headset. It was the most expensive, really, but at the same time, it was by far the best choice for VR. It was wired, of course, in this PC VR, so it has some limitations at this point, but it has the best controllers, it has the best headsets, it has the best tracking, it has everything. The HTC Vive, really Vive's probably best headset and probably best achievement was really their first kind of venture into this. We'll get into the Vive later with some of their later headsets and where they're at now, but the Vive in 2016 was a big breakthrough, and this was they were partnered with Valve and Steam over there. That's where those base stations actually came into play there, and it was just a big thing for the Vive. Another big thing was the Oculus Rift. Obviously, Oculus, very established brand in VR at this point with the development kits as well as the Samsung Gear. Oculus Rift was like their first full-fledged like commercial headset that was meant for like the everyday person. That was its full launch of kind of what the development kits have been building up to. It was a full normal head mounted kind of headset there. It was an improvement in graphics and technology for the headset. It was more comfortable. It was better in virtually every way. It had tracking for the first time, so you could actually track your movement and stuff. It wasn't as good as the Vive, the base stations, and the way they kind of implemented there tracked you much better than the single kind of tracking camera that you can kind of see down here. So yeah, the Vive had a big advantage, but tracking coming in to a trusted brand like Oculus was great. It had a little remote, but you really still didn't use like what you use today with the Oculus or the Meta kind of handles and the controllers there. But still, it was a big improvement over the development kits, and it was the first kind of commercial venture in the VR, like full on commercial venture, and it had tracking and everything. It was a big step for Oculus. One other thing I mentioned, not a picture here, but the Pimax 4K. I believe if I'm almost 100% positive this was Pimax's first venture into VR. I don't mention them much, and this is really the only time they're mentioned, but they're a somewhat prominent PC VR player. It's the big looking headsets with the kind of big glowing V on the front of them that have these wide field of views, a lot of time used for sims and stuff. I figured I'd just mention them, but they're very expensive PC VR wide field of view headsets, and this was their first venture into it. Interesting company if you want to check them out, but not something I wanted to spend a lot of time on. But yeah, just to sum up all of these, kind of the main thing here that I want to take away is a big improvement in VR. Very accessible VR headsets for the first time, very powerful VR headsets for the first time, good tracking, good controllers for the vibes and stuff. Accessible to everybody with the PlayStation VR. It was a big year for VR. It was a massive year for VR. Some things that are going to get improved on, though, we'll kind of touch on them in a minute here with tracking and wireless and stuff. We'll get to in the future, but VR Boom 2016. Move on to another pretty busy slide here, but a pretty important slide. The kind of VR expansion age, kind of before we get to the current age of VR right now. What happened in 2017 to 2022? So 2017 was a pretty dead year. The big thing that happens was Windows mixed reality. A lot of kind of really cheap, weird headsets in both VR and augmented reality came out with Windows mixed reality. It was probably the biggest highlight of 2017, but not a very important highlight and not something that would last very long or do very well, not received pretty well. Going into 2018, we have some more important stuff. We have the Oculus Go, which is really obviously another headset from Oculus here, but important because the Oculus Go was the first venture away from these like everything up to the year had been aside from the Sony, PlayStation VR and the mobile VR and stuff. PlayStation or VR had always been wired to a PC. PC VR wired or console wired and everything. The Oculus Go was really the first venture into something that broke that mold, and the fact that it was kind of the first attempt by Oculus anyway, because there was other attempts by the and you can see on this slide, there was other attempts by other company, but the Oculus Go was Oculus. It's like its first attempt to break the mold of having a wired, headset. It was the first standalone headset that Oculus really did. It was affordable, it was wireless, and it was a more casual VR experience than a lot of the headsets have gone. Obviously, it'd be outdone pretty quickly and pretty, firmly in the following years here, but it was the first attempt at it, so I just figured I'd add that in there. You have the HTC Vive Pro. It looks exactly like the Vive from the earlier slide, but it's blue instead. Basically, just an upgrade all around for a little more expense. Vive continues with that as well as the Vive in general to be kind of the dominant in 2018 and continues to be the dominant kind of PC VR headset. They kind of dominate the market. Vive from 2016 to about 2019 is the premier product as far as PC VR goes, and the Vive Pro just solidifies that a little more. Then the kind of finish out 20 or to go into 2019, pretty busy year here, pretty amazing year here. Before we get to the big ticket item, Oculus actually has two headsets come out this year. They have the Rift S and the Quest. The Rift S is really Oculus or now Meta's was their last kind of foray into PC VR. It had better tracking, had better graphics and visuals and everything. It was a pretty solid headset, mixed results, but it didn't really supplant the HTC in any way. And the Valve Index, which we'll get onto in a minute, but it was the last foray in the PC VR. A pretty good attempt there, but it is what it is. much more importantly for Oculus in 2019 was the Quest. Obviously, the kind of series of headsets you know and love for today. Oculus Quest, kind of Oculus's second go at a fully like standalone, unsupported by like PC VR headset. This was a very important headset. Of course, it would get pretty easily supplanted and blown out of the water the following year, but it was very important because it started off the Quest series that is kind of legendary today and is the biggest kind of VR headset series in the world right now. It's a big thing there. The Vive does release another headset following the Vive Pro in 2019, another big one. The HTC Vive Cosmos, not a very popular or good headset. Doesn't really supplant the Vive Pro at all. Doesn't outdo it. Not very popular. Pretty expensive as most of their products. Didn't do very well. They also did eye tracking, which was the first kind of big mainstream venture into that. Pretty interesting technology. Still used today in a lot of headsets. Basically, wherever you're looking is kind of higher resolution. Everywhere else is kind of rendered down to save in processing power. Pretty interesting development there in 2019 with Vive. And the big ticket item, which is the first picture we have actually in 2019, kind of the bottom left one, there's the Valve Index. Obviously, one of the most major developments in VR history. Valve Index kind of in 2019, obviously there was some shipping delays, but in 2019 into 2020 when it's released, becomes the foremost premium PC VR headset, and it's still used to this day. You know, coming up on like 6 years later since it launched or whatever, it is still used to this day. It is still considered a very comparable headset today. In 2019, though, this was huge. This was Valve's first venture in the VR after they've helped HTC Vive for a while. It is They knock it out of the water. The headset is fantastic. The audio, the microphone, the visuals are top of the line in every way. It's the best thing in the market. It's expensive, but it is the premium. It is the best choice on the market for PC VR by far and away. The audio, the visual, the microphones are great. The tracking with the Valve kind of index, or not the Valve, but the Valve and HTC kind of base stations there are amazing. The handles, I still think to this day the best VR handles that have ever been released. It's very ergonomic, very comfortable in your hands. The designs are great. It feels great. It's sturdy. Just tremendous headset. Top of the line, and it stays that way as the top premium headset really until pretty recently here, in the last couple of year or two. That has kind of been challenged or supplanted in a less obvious way here, but we'll get to that later. But Valve Index, huge breakthrough in VR. It's tremendous, and that with the games, the Steam VR page opens up. It's such a breakthrough in VR. Moving on to 2020, the big ticket item of 2020. Outside of some other big ticket items, of course, coming into these years here, the Oculus Quest 2, another just absolute banger of a VR headset and a VR breakthrough and milestone here. Oculus Quest 2 supplants, it's the bottom right picture for reference there, supplants the Quest and improves on it in virtually every way, like every iteration of the Quest has. It's an affordable standalone, very powerful and very good VR headset. It doesn't really quite challenge the Valve Index as far as quality and high-end premium, really everything. It's slightly worse, or not say slightly. It's just a little worse in every way outside of the fact the portability and the versatility of it and the Valve Index. The Valve Index is still the premium headset choice and still is for years to come here. But the Oculus Quest 2 is affordable. It's standalone. You don't need a fucking gaming PC and a powerful PC to play it. It still looks great. It tracks great. It's the complete kit here. It's wireless. It's non-PC. It's standalone. The Quest 2 is a major breakthrough. The year following another major breakthrough in the Valve Index. It's a great time to be in VR in this kind of couple of years here. It is just, it's fantastic. It's still to this day in 5 years later, and another Quest released, Quest 3 and 3S, still one of, if not, I don't think it's the most used Quest anymore, but still one of the most used, like top 5 most used VR headsets in the market right now. It has really stood the test of time. It's still very playable today. Just a fantastic headset, a big breakthrough in VR there. And then, kind of coming off of 2020, you really hit a bit of a stall here in the last couple of years of the VR expansion era slide here. 2021 and 2022 really didn't hit as hard as the kind of previous years and iterations here. You get in 2021, it's really HTC Vives just taking a lot of cracks at the bat, not really doing much. The Vive Pro 2, again, a slight expansion to the Vive Pro, but at this point, it doesn't supplant the Valve Index at all. It's an expensive headset. It doesn't really outdo the Valve Index at all, so it's kind of at a weird place in the market. It doesn't do too well. Still Valve or HTC Vive's premier option, but with the Valve Index being there, it just really doesn't have a place in a lot of people's mind. You get the HTC Vive Focus 3 in 2021 as well. Again, not as good as the Valve Index, not really as good as the MetaQuest 2. It kind of fails in both camps there. Not a very successful headset. One interesting thing that does come from HTC Vive though is face tracking, like full-on face tracking and everything that eventually gets put in some other headsets like the one below it. But full-on face tracking, which is an interesting development in the VR. It's cool that you can track facial expressions and stuff. Obviously, it's a big stepping stone in VR. Tracking has always been, with eye tracking, with full body tracking, with face tracking, has always been something to track there. It's a big development, obviously, but it's mostly used by weirdos in VR chat. Past that, we have in 2022 to kind of wrap up the VR expansion era here. Another offering from our friends at Oculus, now Facebook and then Meta here. The MetaQuest Pro in 2022, still viable today, but it's kind of like the premium, kind of working man's premium VR headset here. Almost kind of marketed towards a more utilitarian approach of like workers and like replacing monitors and PCs and stuff, but still more than capable for gaming, of course. It's in the top right there for reference. Expensive headset, but it's really good. It has like eye and face tracking, I believe. It's got OLED displays, maybe. Don't quote me on that one though. Or no, it has Pancakes lens, which is another pretty big development there, which makes things look a lot clearer in VR. Interesting headset, but nothing that like blew people's socks off or anything. Now, the final slide here, getting into the current era here. You can see some big players here. Because for the until 2023, when you're talking, when you take a look back, 2022, 2021, and all that stuff, really people were kind of it was kind of a downtime for VR, but 2023 really comes back with some just absolute fucking bangers here. Um, some mainly in 2023, I mean, PlayStation VR 2. This is Sony's successor to its original PlayStation VR for the PlayStation VR 2 here for the PlayStation 5. The PS, the PlayStation 5's VR accessory, again, outdoes it in every way. It's better. The controllers are way better and more ergonomic. They're really nice. Have haptics. We've got a more comfortable VR headset that looks cool. The design's great. We've got eye tracking and OLED displays. We've got better resolution. The headset itself is better. The console it's running off is better. They got more games and support for it. It's great. It's a great headset. It's top three headsets on the market right now easily. Um, One negative drawback from it coming out was like the price point. It was like $550 initially at launch, which was slightly more than the console it ran off itself. That's since been kind of drawn back. And the drawing back of that price, as well as the holiday sale recently, like I touched on in my PlayStation VR 2 review, this thing exploded. A lot of these units were sold at the price point of $350, which is great. It got a lot of people into the VR space here. That is a great headset. That was a great breakthrough for PlayStation. Next, 2023 and 2024, we saw the Meta Quest 3 and 3S. Obviously, Meta's expansion of the Quest line, Fallen 2. This is, if you take anything away from this slide, is the Meta Quest 3 and 3S. This is the biggest breakthrough and the premier and top dog VR headsets on the market currently. These things are just fantastic. Again, another massive improvement in the Quest series. It seems like they do this every time they release a Quest. It's just fantastic. The 3 and the 3S are both great. They're both improvements visually speaking and performance speaking over the Quest 2 and a lot of other VR headsets that were in between there. They're great. The price point is fantastic, $500, $350, and $300 respectively for all versions. Very affordable. They're standalone wireless headsets. They've got good graphics, good technology, good battery, relatively speaking. Some fantastic game support, comfort. I mean, great controllers without rings on them. I mean, that's just the 3 and 3S are the top dogs in VR. As I kind of hit on my video review of them, they're fantastic. Another thing that comes in 2023 is the big screen beyond. Kind of the leftmost top left photo there with the glasses looking one with a wire coming down off of it in the white. Not a huge thing, but I figured I mentioned it because it's new, ish, and it's a development in the fact that it's the first kind of its design and form factor here. The first VR headset that's actually pretty good that you see, and it's kind of like glasses like design here. There's like head strap glasses design. Very interesting technology, very powerful. It's a PC VR headset. The big thing with this though is the field of view. It is fucking massive. You know, as the big screen beyond name would entail, it's got an amazing field of view, very wide field of view. Used a lot in like simulator games like Flight Simulator. Very interesting, powerful technology. Interested to see where that goes in the future. The last thing I'm gonna mention in the present day of VR is the Apple Vision Pro. Obviously more of an augmented reality thing, but still, this is Apple's kind of first foray into this scene here. Absolutely great headset display wise. Technology has got OLEDs, the best pass through we've ever seen. Very exciting technology. As you can see, the price point there is the fucking major issue. $3,500 for what isn't a VR headset. It's an augmented reality headset. Doesn't have a lot of gaming potential, but it's a very powerful headset. Very interesting developments and pretty cool technology as far as what pass through can do and stuff like that. But we're hoping to see a next iteration with that that's not absurdly expensive, and maybe it'll be something. Now, onto the future of VR and where I think is next. I just put some stuff there. The Valve Index 2, obviously, if you remember, it's been quite a few years at this point since the Valve Index released. It's starting to get dated. It's not really the premier, even PC VR headset on the market right now. It's just it's a bit dated. Not a lot of news on the Index 2, but it's expected to come or be announced somewhat in the next couple of years, at least. So interested to see that. The next Quest, or is the Quest 4 and 4S ever going to come? It will, of course, but not in the near future. Obviously, just this last year that the Quest 3S launched, they're probably not going to be looking to make a new headset for the next couple of years, probably. But yeah, something to keep out there. There will be there. Again, like I said, next Apple Vision Pro or Apple Vision, it's going to have to bring down the price point significantly if it wants to do anything. Apple, I'm speaking of, wants to do anything with VR, augmented reality. It's going to have to slash that price. I'd say at least get it down to 1,000 or less. If it can find a way to do that and keep the performance and keep it improving and adding features, it's got a future. If not, it's kind of just going to be a one-off kind of interesting experiment there. Future for the HTC company, the HTC Vives. Because as I said, they're kind of in a weird spot in the market. After the HTC Vive and the Vive Pro kind of dominating high-end PC VR gaming there from 2016 and like 2019, HTC just hasn't really been doing very well in the current age. Um, they're not really the premier PC VR headsets at anything anymore. They're still pretty expensive. They've taken forays into both like business-facing VR that doesn't do very well as like wireless and standalone VR that doesn't even hold a candle to the Quest series of headsets. It's just a lightweight at all. Like it's a company that is a jack of all trades. It's got PC VR, it's got standalone, it's got business facing, it's got everything you can imagine. Like it's got glasses even, but it just doesn't do it as well as any other company. So HTC needs a big win here and a big breakthrough, or they're kind of going to fall to the wayside even more so than they are. But yeah, so that's kind of the recap and timeline of VR there. No, it was kind of a pretty big ramble there and kind of a lot of info and words thrown at you, but I just thought it was interesting. I know I've touched on VR a lot here. I kind of just wanted to do a video to showcase kind of what VR has looked like over the years and kind of do a lot of these headsets and a lot of this in one swoop here. But yeah, I hope you guys found that kind of interesting or informative there. Let me know in the comments down below if you have any questions or what your thoughts are on that. If you enjoyed the video or informed or entertained by it at all, encourage you to like and subscribe. Definitely helps the channel, and I'm loving the support I'm getting recently. I always love the supporters, but just really appreciative of the recent booms I'm getting with a lot of the content I'm putting out. But yeah, so that does it for this video, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next video.